Hello, everyone. This is Harun from the Legacies of Learning Project at Cardiff University. I'd like to welcome you all to our podcast series where we look at important work that has been done in the field of Islamic learning in the past and think about how it can contribute to learning and questions that are facing humanity today. So, we all know that education, pedagogy, learning has been the subject of detailed discussion amongst Muslim authors right from its inception until this very day. Our Legacies of Learning project draws on a range of historical sources in the Islamic tradition in order to investigate notions of learning and knowledge production in the Islamic world. In this series, we aim to talk to leading scholars and academics who are exploring the Islamic intellectual tradition and who can help us explore the potential educational implications and application of this tradition in the contemporary period. In this chat, I'm honored to have with me Dr. Fozia Bora. Welcome to our book chat.
Thank you so much, Harun. It's a pleasure and privilege to be here.
Alhamdulillah. So, if you don't mind, I'm just going to indulge a little bit and introduce yourself to our viewers so they know a little bit about you. Dr. Fozia is a research and teaching scholar who focuses on the history and historiography of early and medieval Islam, specifically Arabic historical texts of the Fatimid, Ayyubid, and Mamluk eras in the 6th to the 9th century, Islamic centuries. That's the 12th to the 15th centuries. And we'll talk about that in this conversation a little bit more, I hope, as well. Just a little bit more, because it's worth mentioning more about her educational background. She took her undergraduate degree and postgraduate degree at the University of Oxford, where she began her academic journey by studying for a BA in English, after which she spent 2 years working as a journalist, interestingly, in London. Later, she returned to academia for an MPhil in classical and medieval Islamic history. This led to a specialization in Mamluk historiography, and after an extended period of maternity leave, to doctoral research, for which she made a diplomatic edition of the Mamluk scholar Ibn Furat's underappreciated yet rich account of late Fatimid rule from the unique autograph manuscript of his multi-volume chronicle of the Islamic world, and produced an historiographical analysis of his corpus of text, which we'll talk about in this session, inshallah ta'ala. Her current research focuses on two main strands. And number one is the artistic, epistemological, and archival value of the Arabic Mukhtasar or digest, both across genres and in history writing in particular. And the second one is the history of local Muslim communities in Bradford, that's in West Yorkshire. So I think with that introduction, I just want to say thank you for being here. I know you're extremely busy and you have a lot of commitments, so I'm honored that you've given us your time and given us an opportunity to learn about your important work and your project. So thank you for being here once again.
Thank you, Harun. That was a very generous introduction. And I'm excited. I know that the Legacies of Learning Project has an important role to play in allowing us to bring together different kinds of research on intellectual traditions in the Islamic world and the different methodologies by which we approach them in the modern day. So I'm excited to be part of these conversations.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. So let's dive straight into your book, if I may. Tell us what your book is about and who the book is about, because it's not just what, it's the who as well. That's very, very important. And in the past, just for information, when we've been talking about Islamic tradition, history, we've also been intertwining it with people, because it's important that in our tradition, Islamic tradition, it's so much about people as much as institutions. So if I may give you the floor to talk about who and what the book is actually about.
Sure, thanks. When you introduced me, you kindly mentioned my kind of educational journey, and part of that was doing an MPhil in Islamic history. It was called Classical and Medieval Islamic History at the Oriental Institute in Oxford, and part of that journey of learning for me involved looking at some Arabic manuscripts in the Bodleian Library, including a manuscript by a Fatimid author called Al-Quda'i, and that was the beginning for me of kind of getting obsessed with Arabic historical texts in manuscript form, some of which have never been edited or looked at in any kind of depth or with any kind of analytical kind of rigor. Rather, they're alluded to here and there, but not really they've not really been the focus of study in themselves. And many of these texts are unedited and kind of out of the public domain in many ways. So when it came to kind of thinking about a project for my doctorate, I had then the wonderful advice of my then supervisor, the late wonderful Donald Richards. And he and I embarked on a journey of looking at a Mamluk author, Ibn al-Farad, whose historiographical work survives in 2 different series. Many of the extant volumes are housed in Vienna, and they have not been looked at in the kind of depth that they deserve. So my research in the book is about Ibn al-Farad, a Mamluk era author, a muhaddith, a notary witness, and a historian, and his much neglected book of history. And the book I wrote about him is an appreciation of his way of writing history, which is to preserve early text witnesses to history, and to arrange them in new and interesting ways, to tell important stories, not just about the past that he's depicting, but also reflect on his present through the prism of these earlier sources. And he creates what I've called an archive of historiographical texts. And I use the term archive knowing that it's an imported word. And we can get into the topic of terminology as we go on. But to me, it seemed to capture a tendency to both want to preserve and to order knowledge in particular kinds of ways for the benefit of present readers, but also for posterity. So the book is both a discussion of Ibn al-Farad and his book and his way of writing history, but also a discussion of what chronicles in general bring to their readers. Why are they written? What do they allow us to understand about the past? And what kinds of methodologies are being deployed in the writing of chronicles and other forms of writing in the medieval Islamic sphere. So the book is, it's got, on the one hand, tells a story of a person and his book, but also kind of presents an interpretation of that whole methodology of writing, and I've called it an archival methodology. So there are sort of 2 different things going on. One is quite localized, and the second, I would say, has broader implications for people to consider.
Thank you for that wonderful overview. So when I read your book, and this conversation many of us have had in the past, and this is an ongoing conversation, what do we mean by the medieval period? Because a lot of people will be wondering, a lot of our viewers will be wondering, what are these periodizations? And what does a medieval period mean? And what is its origin? Is it something that's part of the Islamic tradition, or is it something that's part of another tradition?
So I think it's a real challenge to find terminologies that suit our source material or our research questions in perfect ways. And one of the things I kind of begin the book with is a discussion of terminology, knowing that the term medieval is a Eurocentric term. It applies really more to the European past than to the Islamic world past. And even the term Islamic world or the term European are kind of terms that can be questioned. I decided at the time to use the word medieval because I wanted the book to be intelligible to English-speaking audiences. But I also, as I say in the book, but also have reflected subsequently, these terms are imperfect. And it's important that we reflect on the imperfection of our terminology and the framings that they suggest or even impose, and to kind of explain what terms we're using and why. But it's also important not to reify them or to essentialize them too much and to recognize their contingent nature. So in that sense, the term medieval is a good example of a word which, although I use, I'm actually very dubious about. And I suppose if I wrote the book again, I would perhaps not use the word, or I interchange the word medieval with the word middle period of history, which is a term coined by the late great Marshall Hodgson. And in a sense, if you want your book to be a teaching tool or a kind of an aid to learning, then the use of conventional terms can be helpful. But as much as they illuminate in one way, they also obfuscate in another. So medieval is a term that maps more closely onto European history. Although, of course, European historians also question the periodization of their own source material, but also their own framings of history. For the Islamic period, we have these sort of conventions of there being early or formative periods of Islamic history, and then the classical period, the medieval period, and the post-classical and post-medieval. In my book, I use the term medieval as a shorthand for a particular set of eras, which is the dynastically kind of framed eras of Fatimid, Ayyubid, and Mamluk history. So going from roughly, and I'm going to use the Western dating here, just for ease of the readers, roughly from 909, which is when the Fatimid era is inaugurated formally in North Africa, to the end of the Mamluk period, which is around 1517 for the kind of Mamluk era in Egypt. So for me, medieval is specifically referring to those centuries, and of course these are Islamic dynasties. So the word medieval isn't an easy fit, but nevertheless, I wanted a shorthand, as I said, and medieval seems to capture those three dynastic eras for me, for the purposes of the book specifically. But you're right to begin with that question: what does medieval even mean? Thomas Bauer would argue that there was no such thing as an Islamic medieval period, and he makes an important point there. But I suppose these are terms of convenience, not essential, not uncontingent, and certainly not universal. So that, I guess, that skeptical approach to terms, I think, is quite important.
Yeah, and your final point is very, very important. We're aware of the histories of these terms and the genealogies of these terms, but we are in a situation where we need to use them as a shorthand or a useful shorthand for people to try and at least have some sort of understanding of periodizations. But we need to be aware that they have been subject to criticism and critique as well. In your book, when I first started reading your book, the subtitle gripped my attention more than the title itself, believe it or not. And the subtitle, for the benefit of our viewers, is "The Value of Chronicles as Archives." Can you explain that for our viewers and what it means?
Absolutely. So by chronicle, I'm referring to narrative texts of history, in which historians in the kind of early periods of Islamic history and the so-called medieval periods of Islamic history would collect reports of the past, on the past. This was an oral tradition that then became a written tradition, as you probably know, because it's a sort of similar story to what happens with hadith, and also with poetry. And in the kind of earliest sort of texts of historiography that we have, they do tend to emerge from maghazi or battle narratives, and also from the hadith themselves. And the chronicle is a compendium of these reports. They take different kinds of formats. So some chronicles are universal chronicles, the kind that Ibn al-Farad writes. Others are much more specific. So you might have a chronicle of a city, you might have the chronicle of a dynasty, you might have the chronicle of a century, a particular Islamic century. You might have a chronicle outlining a very specific set of events. So different kinds of chronicles were written to serve different sorts of readership and different sorts of intellectual purposes. So that's what I mean by chronicle. The phrase, "the value of chronicles as archives," is an argument I'm making through the book, which is that we should perhaps think again about the chronicle, not simply as a collection of reports put together as a sort of patchwork quilt of narrations to help us understand the past, but we should also see the chronicle as a repository, as an archive, or a carefully selected and ordered arrangement of texts, which then preserves them for readers into the future. So in a sense, what I'm arguing for is a reconsideration of chronicles as important knowledge archives, epistemological archives, as I call them. In other words, as important repositories for texts which might otherwise be lost. And in fact, Ibn al-Furat is a good example of a historian who writes a chronicle in which he preserves texts that are not otherwise extant. So that's my kind of the framing of the book, is to reconsider some of these chronicles, particularly ones which cite sources very diligently and tell us where the source material comes from, the names of books, the names of authors, and this gives us an alternative book history than the history of extant texts. So on the one hand, one can trace the history of Islamic book writing through manuscripts and then editions. In other words, the books that we have. And of course, there's a survival bias there because, that's not the whole picture. We see books referred to that are not extant. And then an alternative book history can be derived from the pages of books that are extant. And that alternative book history includes or incorporates texts which don't survive in themselves, but are still present with us as extracts in the books that we have. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you. So I'm always interested in a question, and it's a question that is important, I guess. These were Islamic scholars. Ibn Furat, who we'll talk about, I hope, a little bit more. He was an Islamic scholar, and of course, that's also a kind of loaded term when we say they're Islamic. But why were Islamic scholars writing about history?
There are different kinds of reasons, and and I say kinds of reasons because I think each there are clusters of reasons, let's say. Part of what makes history compelling, and it is compelling because we see so many different kinds of people devoted to the retellings of history. Part of the discussion of why historiography developed at all connects historiography with the religious tradition. The idea being that we cannot understand the texts or the sources of Islam, including the Quran or the Hadith or the legal texts, or indeed any work produced by ulama, if we don't understand the context in which they were writing, the context in which they wrote sources and also commentaries on sources and reinterpretations of sources and digests of sources. That kind of complicated world of scholarly conversation required explication of the non-bookish context in which books were written. I say non-bookish meaning the worlds outside of the text, the context, needed explanation. And so historiography can be read as the provision of that context. But there's also a strong political bent to history writing. Sometimes history books would be written at the behest or under the patronage of a ruler or a dignitary or a person with influence and money. At other times, the ulama were moved to write books of history in order to comment on the past, to reinterpret the past according to their own outlook, and also to use historiography as a platform for critique of either past rulers or present rulers, and also to assert their own vision of what a moral life looks like. So there's a host of different kinds of motivations that can be discerned from the ways in which historiography is produced. And oftentimes we have authors telling us what they wish to do in their works, what they wish to achieve through their works in introductions to their books, and Ibn al-Furat is one of them. For those sorts of reasons, historiography became a very popular genre of writing for authors who were often otherwise well known for other kinds of writing. So, for example, al-Dhahabi wrote Tarikh al-Islam, but of course he's extremely well known for being a prolific and extremely accomplished muhaddith. So you find that rarely is a historian writing only history. Often they're sharpening their critical tools across a range of disciplines. But the popularity of history, historiography, endures over the centuries. And I would argue that the motivations for writing initially may have been connected to both reflecting and shaping religious norms later in kind of Islamic world history. There's a lot more of using historiography as a set of tools or methodologies for commenting on the present and commenting on sultanic behavior and commenting on the decline of civilization. I don't want to be too kind of I don't want to overgeneralize too much or make it sound too entropic, but you do see those tendencies, that there was such a thing as a golden glorious past, and we've moved far away from that. And using, I mean, the Universal Chronicle is a good example of how sometimes there's a kind of there are layers of historiography where the past is idealized. Not always, but often idealized. And that becomes the kind of foundation for a set of critiques of the present, events leading up to the present. So, I mean, I am overgeneralizing, and that's perhaps not wise, but there are sort of, let's say, threads that run through these long traditions of history writing, and kind of appreciating the past for its sort of for its kind of being a golden age for the religion. As I said, it's idealized, is a fairly common way of dealing with the past across, time periods and through the work of different kinds of authors. But there's also quite a lot of diversity in what that idealized past is and what uses it's put to. It could be a way to ingratiate yourself with a ruler. Well, that's fairly uncommon, but often it's to bring together knowledge in as broad a sense as possible. And Ibn al-Furat is in that mold. And then also moving on to the present day, or coming towards recent history, and being much more, let's say, open in lamenting the behaviors of rulers or military generals, and people in power, really.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So here's a question that it's more personal. It's about you. Can you tell us about your own work? When I was reading this work, your book in particular, it's clear that you spend a lot of time engaging with this material, translating, editing. Can you tell me a little bit about that, about your own work in this?
Sure, yeah. So I think I kind of mentioned earlier about how I kind of came to love Arabic manuscripts of historiography through doing an MPhil. My career has always been kind of characterized by doing things later than most people. So I came to learning Arabic when I was in my mid-20s. I hadn't learned Arabic formally until then, and I spent some wonderful periods of time in Morocco and Jordan studying the language. But my work on Arabic manuscripts really was done in Oxford with my marvelous supervisor Donald Richards, and I had also worked with the late Muhammad al-Shayyal, another amazingly prolific but profoundly wise and wonderful scholar. And through my working with these incredibly inspirational people, I kind of developed a real curiosity about how these texts are put together. And in a sense, having an English degree background, was very helpful, because that was the beginning of my passion for written text and what they mean for their audiences, but also how they put together through different kinds of methodologies. How do they relate to their context, and what are the sort of what you might call metatextual meanings? What do readers derive from them beyond the literal meaning of the text? And so this kind of the journey of this particular book on Ibn al-Furat really goes back to my interest in English texts, my undergraduate degree, and then moving into Islamic history and seeing the manuscripts that have been untouched and unexamined, and reading between the lines of these texts to kind of discover what kinds of sources historians could draw on. And I love the detective work involved, the kind of putting together of a story. And I don't mean the stories that historians are telling in their chronicles. I mean the stories that we want to tell using these texts. Draws you into a world of reading across genres, across authors, across writing from different periods. And that is now made easier through kind of digital humanities methods of that people like Sarah Savant and her team are pioneering through the Kitab project. In my day, when I was doing my PhD research, we didn't have those tools. So for me, it was a case of sitting down and reading Arabic texts of historiography. And I just found that absolutely captivating. One text would lead me to another text because these texts are highly intertextual, referential, self-referential, but also making reference to other kinds of texts. And so, although one can never be exhaustive because there are so many texts and so many authors and so many references, you can eventually start to build a picture of how texts are created, what kinds of uses they're put to, and the agency of the author. And I felt very passionate about exploring the agency of the author, because the assumption has sometimes been prevalent that in compiling a text formed of other texts, there isn't any originality involved. And I could see for myself how different each compilation was from another, and how a very different slant could be put on a set of texts through the act of arranging, ordering, juxtaposing, omitting, summarizing, and so on. So the agency of authors is something that's always really interested me. And so through this project of the book and the work on Ibn al-Farad, I was really able to pursue that in quite a lot of depth. And that for me was a really joyful journey. I mean, my current research, you mentioned looking at the history of local communities in Bradford, that involves looking at what's more conventionally thought of as an archive, newspaper archives in the modern era. So in that sense, my writing has shifted a bit, and my thinking has shifted a bit. But nevertheless, I think the work of looking into texts, into archives, into the ways in which texts are composed, that I think is kind of a lifelong passion for me, and it's been present through the different phases of work that I've done, and I hope I can continue exploring new ways of reading and let's say dissecting texts to see what's underneath the layers, really. It's like peeling an onion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. So, I mean, your point, you made some very important points. One particular point which struck me was when you mentioned that there's a lot of originality and creativity in these works. It's not simply a case of copy and paste. I think that's an important point. I mean, we could explore that in maybe future lectures in more detail, because sometimes there's these questions that emerge around plagiarism, or people taking ideas from other people and so forth and so on. But you're saying something very, very different. Actually, when you read the text very, very carefully, you see a very, very different picture actually going on there. So I want to move on slightly to the context of Ibn al-Farad. It's interesting, he refers to the Fatimid rulers as caliphs, and he's obviously following Sunnism. I wonder what it tells us about the social milieu at the time, because often we essentialize the past, or we see antagonistic moments in the past and sort of perpetuate those moments when perhaps the situation was much more rich. So I guess this question is important because was there sort of, if we can phrase it, a form of interreligious ecumenism or tolerance, or is this to do with other forces such as their rivalry with the Abbasids?
It's a big question.
I love these sort of conversations, that's why.
No, this is a very important question. I was really struck by, and not just Ibn al-Farad. Ibn al-Farad is a really good example of this, but also other authors, how on the one hand, if they're wearing their ulama hat, they might well be quite scathing about people of other sects or other interpretations of Islam or other madrasas. So there's a difference between firqa and madrasa, as you know very well, because you're an expert on these things. There's a difference between a sect and a school of thought, to use modern terminology, modern English terminology. A school of thought being another legitimate kind of school of interpretation. Firqa being a sect where you consider that the followers of that particular interpretations don't have a legitimate interpretation. So there are different ways of thinking about this. But so when we say interreligious, are we referring to sectarian difference, or are we, which is more kind of, let's say, implacable and irreconcilable, or are we talking about diversity within a particular school of thought? So in terms of the former, there is an assumption that if you're a Sunni author, and if you're a muhaddith like Ibn al-Furat is, and he's one example of many, and I can cite others who have also a non-confessional, let's say non-sectarian tendency in their writing. You see someone like Ibn al-Furat who does refer to the Fatimids as caliphs and imams. He has no problem using that terminology, even though it's not his belief system to acknowledge them as such. In his book of historiography, he will refer to them in these ways. In other words, he does not undermine their claim to religious leadership of the Muslim community. And that's very interesting because, as a Hanafite scholar whose day job is to preach hadith, and he's a notary witness and he officiates marriage contracts, you'd think that he's going to be highly invested in a Sunni, but perhaps even also a Hanafi worldview. But actually, when he writes about the past, when he writes about Fatimids, when he writes about Imam Shi'is, he's not particularly focusing on their religious claim. He treats them as people in the world, doing important things, sometimes bad things. So it's not that he considers them all to be wholly good or wholly bad, but rather he will look at them through a moral prism that doesn't seem to be dictated by his own sectarian background or confessional background. And I think this is very important because one of the kind of qualities or virtues is perhaps the wrong word, but one of the features of our understanding and appreciation of the past is highly skewed in favor of the idea that we're more tolerant now of religious difference than ulama, the scholars of the past, were in their own times. And I think the opposite is actually true. Now, I'm not saying that, in the academy or in society at large, people aren't tolerant, even when they're writing about the Islamic past. But the assumption that people have become more tolerant as time has gone on through the kind of eras of modernity, I think that's wrong. I think it's a secular lens which comes with modernity that makes us look at the past through a sectarian lens. When you look at how ulama behave with each other and with scholars of completely different interpretation of the Islamic past, so Ismaili Shi'i or Ithna Ashariya and so on, yes, there were tracts denouncing people of other sects in other genres, and even sometimes in historiography, but there was also a strong drive to collect learning and to incorporate learning from these different traditions, despite them being theologically irreconcilable. And Ibn al-Furat presents really good examples of this. One of his really important sources, and I say important because this is someone who gives him information that he can't get from anywhere else, is Ibn Abi Tayy, an Imam historian from Aleppo, whose work is not extant, or historiographical work is not extant. He has a wonderful book called Ma'adin al-Dhahab, The Gold Mines of History, and that book is really extant largely through the work of Ibn al-Furat, but also Abu Shama and other historians. And in that you see that Ibn al-Furat is not telling the past through a sectarian lens. He doesn't have a sectarian axe to grind in this particular kind of book, at least. I mean, we know he had other books, and there's no evidence that he was any more sectarian in those books, but you can never be completely sure when you don't have the full range of someone's works in front of you. But before Ibn al-Furat, you had someone like al-Quda'i, who is a Qadi, a Shafi'i working in the Fatimid court, and he writes a book of history on the Fatimids. Again, he doesn't denounce them for being Ismaili. Now, of course, his position is more tricky because he's serving the Fatimids, so arguably it would be extremely risky for him to denounce the Fatimids. But Ibn al-Furat is not in that situation. He's writing centuries after the fall of the Fatimids. No one's there to tell him how to portray them how to represent them. He chooses to give them a fairly positive and rounded appraisal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think it's, quite telling that we might perhaps assume that intolerance was a hallmark of medieval Islamic thinking and writing. But in fact, if you open books, and I don't mean, there are books that are highly sectarian in nature. There are heresiographies, there are books of theology which will, let's say, have a sort of supremacist outlook. But there are numerous other genres of writing where differences of interpretation of the Islamic past and of creeds themselves are not a problem. And I think that's one of the things that I've loved to find out about medieval Islamic history writing.
Thank you for that. Wonderful. I really enjoyed listening to that explanation, and I think it opens a lot of, even within Muslim circles, that we're somehow more tolerant than people of the past. But I think when people start reading text in detail, they find even within mazahib, for example, there is a lot of differences on any number of issues, right?
Right.
And so it's also, when I teach students, I always get to think about the adab of the language that they use as well. So they'll say something like asahul qawl, like the most authentic or the most correct position is this, which is basically saying, well, there's lots of opinions, but according to me, it's this one, right? So there is this epistemic humility, but behind that, there's a lot of contestations that are taking place, which is sometimes masked away in these books that we have to read carefully.
Right.
Which is very important.
Mm.
Nowadays, there's a lot of conversation also about the influence of government or top-down approaches when it comes to education, whether that's here in the West or in Muslim countries, in the secular, post-secular states, however you want to define them. And how much influence was there in the past in knowledge transmission in Muslim societies from, say, the Caliphate or from the Caliph, the Imam?
This is a really big question, and I think there could be danger of overgeneralizing. What we could say, if we were to overgeneralize and to draw some, let's say, broad brush strokes on this question of political influence on knowledge transmission, I would say that the kind of relationship between authors and people in power is complicated by the fact that some authors were people in power. So there were authors who were also military men or political leaders, and there were authors who wrote directly under patronage. But what complicates these connections or these relations between men of power, and they're mostly men, and men who wrote, and they were mostly men. I mean, I say that, certainly in the political sphere there were more women that were prominent than we perhaps appreciate. But in terms of extant books authored by women, there are very few. Aisha al-Ba'uniyya stands out as a singular example, of which there are not many. So let's say, mostly they're men. So the relations between men who wield power, political power or military power, and other kinds of power, let's say cultural power, and those who wrote about them is a complicated one, because on the one hand, we see tendencies of intellectual independence. And we know from episodes like the Mihna of the Abbasid era that there were times when the caliphate itself tried to shape people's beliefs and the writing on those beliefs, or rather the articulation of those beliefs in writing. And those projects of control did not go well. And in a sense, that could be held up as an example of historical episodes which demonstrates the independence of the ulama. But when you get to, for example, the Mamluk era, or even the Fatimid era and the Ayyubid era, the ways in which historiography is produced is quite varied, and motivations could vary, and the way in which the project of writing history is supported could also vary. So you had scholars who were independently wealthy and did not need to be paid to write their works. Konrad Hirschler's book, comparing Ibn Wasil and Abu Shama, is a really interesting case study in kind of the effect of patronage on the kinds of historiography that's produced. And he draws contrast between the work of Abu Shama, who is not so supported, and Ibn Wasil, who is. So one can certainly have case studies which explicate particular relations between kind of patronage and then the historiography that's produced. But one can also, I think, generalize to say that on the whole, history writing tends to be a more independent profession, insofar as it doesn't have the same, let's say, stakes as hadith or theology, kind of works of aqidah and so on. And in that sense, it's seen as a more sort of, let's say, secular discipline. What this means is that often the ways in which the ulama are co-opted by rulers, for example, if they want a fatwa on a particular issue, to dissolve a waqf, for example, in those scenarios, ulama are less free often to take a stance. But when it comes to writing history, you see often that historians are given a free rein. What does that mean? It means that there's a kind of shifting pattern of relations, or shifting patterns of relations between ulama and political rulers. Again, complicated by the fact that some ulama are also men who have power. And for that reason, if I were to encapsulate all of the whole phenomenon of relations between political rulers and writers into a sentence, I would say that the relationship is marked by the independence of writers on the whole, but there are specific instances where writers are ingratiating themselves very clearly with rulers, and then there are people in between who might be kind of obliquely ingratiating themselves. For example, Ibn al-Athir, he's obviously wants the Zengids to come off well in his history because he's patronized by them, and for that reason he's not very keen to give Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi a good image. So there are always complications in these representations of figures and of the past. But I would say, on the whole, if you take the whole body of historiography, and it may be foolish to do so, but I'm going to try. Then I would certainly say that independence of thinking, autonomy of writing, and seizing agency and seizing the freedom to critique both political rulers, systems of rule, and even fellow ulama are present everywhere. You see those critiques everywhere. So I would say that governments did not have that many opportunities to exert direct influence on the writing of history. Of course, there will be notable examples, but one of the beautiful things about Arabic historiography is, and you see it from Tabari and before him and after him, is the fact that works of historiography are polyphonic. They tell many stories in many ways using many sources, and as cultural products, they kind of exemplify what Stuart Hall tells us in the modern era about culture as a space of negotiation. What is it that makes a culture a culture? On the one hand, it's the relationship between individual and society, but how is it articulated? It's articulated through language, and that kind of in Arabic historiography, that the philological tradition of which history writing or historiography is an intrinsic part. You see that negotiation between different ideas, different interpretations, different sources, different vantage points, different approaches to Islamic belief itself. And that's one of the things that makes this material really exciting to work with.
Thank you so much for that. That was wonderful. I really enjoyed the way you complicated the narrative, and I think it's important for people to be aware of that.
Thank you.
We've talked about the past. We've talked about scholarship. We've talked about politics. We've talked about government. How can all of this rich history, this complicated history, this complex history, really help us today? How can you help us answer questions around education, around civilization, around some of the big questions that are facing humanity today?
Mhm. One of the interesting things about historiography is that it's often described as important for identity formation, which is a very modern way of looking at it. Historiography was written to assert or to assert identity, but also to remember the past for the purposes of identity formation, to cement your sense of yourself or your sense of community, your sense of being part of a group of like-minded people. And it could be a communalism of religion, it could be a communalism of language, of city, of the class that you're in, and so on. So you can kind of think of it in different ways. But I think that the question of historiography as part of identity formation can be a bit of a slightly, I think it narrows our understanding in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
And so identity formation, I think, is part of the issue and part of the motivation, of course. But that is very much how we interpret the writing of history, looking back, across centuries. When history is being written, and again, we're reliant to some extent on the kind of prefaces and introductions that authors write to their works in which they explain their motivations. But partly also we're responding to the fact that authors commented on each other's work and critiqued each other's work or built on each other's work. And from that we learn a lot about kind of the sort of the underlying motivations for writing works of history. So I would say that the memorialization of the past that occurs in projects of history writing does, of course, give readers a sense of their community, a sense of their kind of their belief system, the kind of the context in which the sources of Islam were revealed and received and interpreted. So all of that is important. I don't deny the importance of all of that. But I also think that there's another whole side of history writing which I think we could really enjoy and appreciate more in the modern day, which is their playfulness. Their multi-generic nature. So often in writing, you'll see poetry brought in alongside or a few pages on from a transcribed document, and you might see an obituary, and you might see kind of a narration of political events. And quite often, we peg some of these works as belonging to particular genres, and genres do make sense. So, for example, Al-Qashindi writes an enormous and fantastic book on administrative practice, a kind of the arts of letter writing and document writing and so on, which if you're an administrator, you need this kind of handbook. But even in a book like that, you see him transcribing documents as examples of how a document should be written, or the protocols. So in each genre of writing, you see many other genres represented. And that mixing things up and taking joy in the mixing of things, I think is instructive for us. It kind of shows us that in times past, historians of the Islamic world took great pleasure in their writing, and they this was not necessarily ponderous work, kind of an entropic nature thing. We're all heading towards, the day of judgment, and there is critique. There's also a lot of playfulness, and I think that sense of joy and playfulness in moving between genres, different kinds of writing, different registers, I think is an opportunity for us to appreciate that, while people of the pre-modern past, and pre-modern again is a Eurocentric term, but people of the distant past may not have had some of the complicated difficulties of our time. We're living in a time of war. We see what's happening in the Middle East today. We see what's happening to vulnerable communities through an immense war machine. People of the past may have had different kinds of challenges. And of course, in Ibn al-Furad's time, you had, in years, previous to his own, there were the Crusades, the onslaught of the Mongols. So they were not strangers to war or other kinds of turbulence, but they found time to write works using different traditions of knowledge and knowledge making to give them a sense of stability, to give them a sense of joy, to bring a sense of togetherness, and to be creative. So I think what we could take from some of these books, some of these works, some of their methodologies, some of their joie de vivre, if you like, is to bring some of that spirit into our own work, into our own research, into our own knowledge sharing practices, to take joy in these things. I say that, with a sense of sadness that at the moment, we've seen what's happening in Palestine. And we see that part of the erasure is the erasure of knowledge, the erasure of archives, the erasure of libraries. So it's a privilege that we have still with us these Arabic texts of historiography and in other genres. It's a real privilege that we still have them. In other parts of the world, these assets are not available to people, but we do have them, and I think it's important that we, appreciate them in their diversity, in their complexity, but in their joyfulness. And I think we could bring some of that into our own work as well.
Thank you. We're running out of time. Time flies when you're enjoying yourself. I've really enjoyed this. I want to pose a question which is very personal to me, but a lot of viewers will be watching, and a lot of them may have had a traditional madrasa education either here or anywhere else, and they'll be thinking about careers in academia, what they can do, how they can contribute. Some of them might want to pursue further studies alongside their traditional studies, which is a very important skill set that they have. They're able to, read really complex texts, hadith texts, which is why they study history. So I want to ask you, what advice would you give to Darul Uloom or Madrasa graduates who are perhaps contemplating entering academia today?
So, as you said, Harun, those students who've had the benefits of a madrasa training are lucky because they develop the skills to read sources in the original Arabic. And this, having made that journey myself later in life and struggled with it, ever since, I don't consider myself to be, an excellent Arabist by any means, even though I love, reading Arabic historical texts and translating them and editing them and so on. Students of Darul Ulooms have the benefit of having been on that journey of developing a really high-level skill set or skill sets. Let's put it in the plural. Some of those skill sets map very well to the academic training of the academy. Now, what we don't have at the moment is a sophisticated and adequate system of accrediting the learning done in the madrasa system of the UK, and I think that should be there. Although I know that some forms of learning are more visible, than others. I know that we at least used to take students from madrasa backgrounds into our master's programs because they could show an equivalence of learning. So I think the madrasa students have fantastic skills to bring to bear to academia, and you know this, Harun, because you've made that journey yourself. I would say two things though. One is that if you do decide to go into academia, it may still be extremely valuable to bring the skills you gain from academia, and those are skills of knowledge creation, knowledge sharing, doing research in particular ways, back into work in the community. I say that because, to me, one shouldn't limit oneself to a particular career path, having done the deep work that academia allows you to do, which would be an extension of the deep work done in madrasas. So in that sense, there could be a profound continuity between a madrasa education and the academic sphere. But my question is, my point is about what happens after that. I would say don't shy away from the idea that you bring those academic skills to bear on community work. It could be intellectual skills, but also project management skills and knowledge sharing skills. Excuse me. The other point I would make is that academia at the moment, particularly in the humanities, is a shrinking space. It pains me to say this because, if you're in the humanities and you are passionate about it and you see its immense value in the world, you don't want it to be a shrinking space. You want it to be an expanding space, but that isn't the case at the moment. Partly that's to do with the neoliberal model of education that we're in. And, we're in a stage of late capitalism. Things that make money are invested in, things that don't are under pressure. So what does that mean for academia as a place in which to have a career? I would say that if you want to do a PhD or a degree, a master's or a PhD in the academic space, do that, because obviously if that's something that brings you joy and you have a passion for it, you should pursue it. But also keep in mind that academia may not love you back by giving you a professional career path. And I think it's important to state that, because I see so many PhD graduates who end up being used for casual labor and going from one precarious job to another. And I really don't want talented individuals to be in that situation. However, that's the case for some. Others find great joy and opportunity in the academic sphere. So it's a little bit of a variable picture. But what I would argue and what I would suggest and advise is that if you have a passion for learning and you want to go into the academic world, do so with an open-mindedness of what you'll do after you've gained that further education. Keep your options open. Think about other careers. Think about teaching. Think about academia, absolutely. Think about research. Think about things like journalism, things like, working for think tanks, working for NGOs. In other words, thinking broadly about career paths beyond academia. Academia can be an incredibly productive space, but it also carries a burden, the burden of administrative work, the burden of high stakes. Everything that we do in academia is high stakes because we're teaching students. And I think it's important for madrasa students to be mindful of these pressures and to go in with their eyes open. Now, but none of this is meant to be discouragement. If anything, I would say that because madrasa graduates have a high level of facility with learning languages, with research methodologies, with reading texts in their original languages and working with primary sources and with the commentary traditions, they're very well placed to do many kinds of academic work. So if you've got a passion for it, I would say go for it. If you're thinking about it for a career, I would have a plan B and a plan C as well in your mind. So that's what I would suggest.
Thank you so much. That's so enriching, mixed with critical realism, if you like, or this realism of what academia is all about. Because people do sometimes, I've met people as well who think it's a path paved with gold, but it's not. It has lots of financial challenges, but also epistemological challenges as well, which people need to be aware of when they go into these fields.
Yeah,
very, very, very important.
Yes, and sorry to, I should, we didn't get into the epistemological challenge. That's another whole kind of worms. Let's put it that way. But no, you've been negotiating that for a long time. So have I. I think we are in a new dawn. I think there's much more appreciation of work that draws on work in different languages. So, for example, in my field of Arabic historiography, I began my career not looking at many Arabic sources. The more I get into it, the more I see the importance of not having these sort of fault lines of work done in one part of the world versus another. I think madrasa graduates will be extremely well placed to be reading Arabic sources alongside English ones, and they have that real advantage. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's so much more that we can go into and we can talk about, but hence we have to stick to our time limit. I just want to say first and foremost that I really enjoyed this conversation. It's brilliant, and I'm sure our viewers will enjoy it much more. And I want to say thank you on behalf of the Legacies of Learning team for giving us your time.
Thank you. My pleasure, my privilege. Thank you so much.
And for our viewers, I just want to say that you can join us for more on Legacies and Learning projects. You can find out more on our website. You can follow our podcast or our book chats rather, where we explore the Islamic intellectual tradition to look at how the rich legacy can help us today. Until next time, thank you very much. Bye-bye.